Our next presenter is Simon Smith from Bensa.
Okay.
Oh, I stole this.
Oh,
Whoa.
thank you. I'm going to quickly start us off with a controversial statement. So David was saying that AI is going to give us promotion. I'm actually looking forward to when AI gets us to retirement, which would come after the promotion. And in terms of the trough of disillusionment, AI was already there in the AI winter. I think we're in the plateau of productivity now. They're just not saying it. But that stuff's all about the future. I want to start talking today about the past, going to the near past. 24 years ago, believe it or not, there were fewer than 16 million internet users at this time globally. Entire world. And that was the year that Netscape Navigator came out. Right? That was the first web browser that made the web visual. Before that, it was all text, made it mainstream and accessible. And you'd figure at this point that newspaper and magazine publishers would have paid a little bit of attention and thought, well, maybe that's a new medium that might disrupt us. But there wasn't a lot of attention paid. 1996, about 36 million internet users, and still not a lot of attention from newspaper and magazine publishers. And I know that because that was the year I entered journalism school. And when I entered journalism school, we were all given these text-based terminals, and that's what we used to write our stories on. And we would get communications from our professors on these text-based terminals, things like Gopher. I don't know if anybody here ever used that. I had a course in library sciences that they since got rid of, and that was also all based around using libraries. We never talked about the web at all. That was 2 years in. 2 years later, even in Canada, by this point there are almost 150 million internet users globally. And in Canada, where I'm from, Canada's a big, I'm from Toronto specifically. I'm from Canada, that's a massive country. Toronto specifically. So in 98, 150 million internet users, and this new national newspaper launched by a guy named Conrad Black, who some of you may know, is supposed to be a media baron genius, launches a print newspaper in Canada. And the editors and publishers of the newspaper come to my school to talk about this, to us about how great it is. And at that time, I'm getting into digital media, and I put my hand up and said, don't you think the internet might disrupt your business? Like, don't you think that people's attention might wane and go to the internet? And they said they're not quite sure. It wasn't a big focus for them. The internet may still be a fad. Honest truth. I was in a huge room, and they were presenting, and that was the answer that they gave. 2 years later, we know it wasn't a fad. By this point, there are about 360 million internet users, and newspaper ad revenue drops off a cliff. And at the same time, there's another chart that shows Google's ad revenue go from 0 to over $100 billion in exactly the same period of time. Right? Why am I telling you this? Because technological change comes fast, number one, and number two, incumbents often get run over by it. If anybody here has read the book by Clayton Christensen, or many of his works, I'm sure people are familiar with it, it talks about the innovator's dilemma. And what happens is, if you're an entrenched player in an industry, you're focused on a huge market. Think about the market that newspaper and magazine publishers were focused on at that time. They look at the internet, which globally had 16 million users globally, and some of them were like, that is ridiculous. Like, we have that many users, in a country, or that many readers in a country, nothing to worry about. And even as it grows, you're still looking at a very small percentage of any one country is actually online. And if you're not paying attention to how fast it's doubling, it looks like a tiny market that you should ignore. It's a completely rational thing to do. You're optimizing for your current business model. But in just 4 years, that became a very bad idea. Now look at AI. Here are 4 graphs for you. I could have chosen a number of others. These are from the AI Index 2017, so they're already out of date. The one in the top left, which is object detection, is what David talked about. That's ImageNet. That's the ability for a machine to look at an image and tell you what's in it. It went from subhuman performance to superhuman performance in 5 years. The one beside that, speech recognition, same thing. 5 years, we're into the era of superhuman speech recognition. Bottom left is the one that should potentially be most worrisome, or maybe positive if you are looking forward to the post-promotion retirement. That's question answering. Machines now have the ability, this chart's out of date, we've already achieved human parity. Machines have the ability now to get a bunch of text, you can ask them a question about the text, and they will give you an answer at the same level as a human. And that's called the squad data set. And then you see the startups that are taking all of this technology and using it to disrupt industries. I could have shown a similar chart, which is investment into AI. So this is coming way faster than the growth of internet users, which took about 20 years. Here we've seen in 5 years that we're hitting superhuman levels of performance. So, should you be worried? This is where I would say no. And the reason is, if you look at what happened in the 90s with the internet, it wasn't that the internet was competing, or any internet publisher was competing with magazine and newspaper journalists for quality. They weren't on a level playing field. It was simply the fact that the internet was sucking the attention out of the media market. So you had things like web browsers and email and social media. And remember MySpace and Friendster, the pre-Facebook sites, and then Facebook came along. All these, they were all just sucking attention away. The quality, as we see recently with fake news, was not on par with what you would expect from journals, but it didn't matter. They took the attention away. But the difference with machine learning is that quality matters. To build a good machine learning model that can give you realistically reliable inference or prediction, you need data that doesn't have errors and biases. And what are scholarly publishers good at? Data that is reliable and valid and has been through peer review. And that's why this time is different. In the area that I work in, which is AI for drug discovery, I track all the startups. There are about 81 of them. And almost all of them, to some degree, rely on scholarly papers to build their machine learning models in their businesses. And there are 4 specific areas, and David alluded to some of them earlier, where I think you can focus in order to increase subscription revenue, licensing revenue, and pay-per-view revenue. First one is leveraging the archive. So I've seen various stats, but the one that I think is probably close to true is that there are more than 114 million peer-reviewed articles published since the dawn of peer review. Some of those are probably completely outdated, but they're still there and exist. There's so much data out there, just not in the articles themselves, but in any ancillary data sets or images or figures or so on. Lots of stuff that you can use. The second one is multiplying use cases. An article isn't an article. It's a bunch of discrete elements that can be disconnected and recombined. It was a presentation from Elsevier this morning that showed one of the examples of that. You can extract content. You can use it in different ways. I'll show you how we do that shortly. Third, and David mentioned discoverability. You think about Amazon and how they're able to drive so much e-commerce through product recommendations. You can do something very similar with machine learning for articles where you're making recommendations that researchers may never have considered, even driving interdisciplinary discoveries, which is something hugely valuable. And then the fourth one would be optimizing the publishing process itself. Meta was given as an example. They have a product called Bibliometric Intelligence that can predict the impact of manuscripts. You can find good peer reviewers who are experts on a specific topic. I've seen a company that has a machine learning tool that will evaluate the statistics in a manuscript and tell you whether the conclusions are valid based on those statistics. So there's lots of opportunity to use machine learning for publishing itself. Okay, all of this brings me to 2 slides about what I do, because I actually don't like the self-promotional aspect of these, but it's relevant to the talk. So forgive me for 2 slides. First is, what the hell is BenchSci and what do we do? So in a nutshell, we use machine learning to reduce the cost of scientific experiments. More specifically, we help researchers choose the best products, the best reagents for their experiments based on what the scientific literature says they should use. So we currently are focused on antibodies. As an example, a researcher wants to run an antibody experiment. They have 4 million products to choose from, 4 million antibodies to choose from, okay? That's like trying to bake a cake and having 4 million different types of flour. How do you possibly know what to use? Well, they know what to use by going to the scientific literature and seeing what other scientists have used, but that's an incredibly labor-intensive process. So what we do, relative to those 4 opportunities I just talked to you about, we leverage an archive of about 6 million papers and growing. Some of those are open access. We also have relationships with publishers where we get access to closed access data as well. And then from this data, these papers, we go in and we extract the figures. We create a new use case. It's the figures that tell scientists whether a product is worth using or not, because if it's a good figure, it shows that the product associated with the figure is worth using. Those figures link to the full text, which drives additional traffic to publishers, and if any of the researchers have a subscription to wherever they're driven to, they can then access the full text, otherwise they can't. So we're driving additional interactions and revenue. And then we maximize discoverability. A lot of this content is hidden away and it's impossible to find through traditional keyword-based search engines. So we use machine learning to read the articles for the researchers, pull out all of the information they can glean from it, and then use bioinformatics to put it all together. To make this a little more concrete, imagine you're researching a protein. So you type in a protein in the search box, and you're using a specific technique, maybe a Western blot, you tick that, and you're doing the experiment in a rabbit, so you tick that, and you're looking at cancer, so you tick that, and you want only antibodies from these companies that you happen to have a procurement deal with, you tick those off. Suddenly you have all the figures that are relevant to your exact experimental context. The system is helping you make a decision. It's not just giving you information. And we can help researchers find antibodies 24 times faster and at about 75% cheaper this way. And then finally, we can optimize the process for publishers. We can tell you what people are searching for where they can't find articles. So we can tell you where there's a gap in the scientific literature. We can also look at where there's an increased amount of interest over time, and we can compare that to publications where there was proteins that became of great interest over time. We can see a similar trajectory and tell you which proteins are going to be of interest in future. And those are just a couple of the examples. So I just want to close, and it doesn't sound like my alarm went off, so maybe I'll keep going, but this is my last slide. So. Oh, it's not the 90s. It's a very different situation. Quality matters. You're the gatekeepers of quality content. It's probably the most valuable asset right now in machine learning, so seize the opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you.